Hi, good afternoon. I'm Lonnie Stonich, the Executive Director of FAN. We're a nonprofit that presents programming exploring human development across the lifespan. I am so excited and honored to welcome you to today's conversation between Professor Emily Falk and Professor Ethan Kross. Thanks for joining us. FAN's YouTube channel has an archive of over 350 videos of past events, so be sure to subscribe to the channel to get updates when new recordings are posted. And now for some introductions. Emily Falk is a professor of communication, psychology, marketing and operations, informatics and decisions, that's a mouthful, at the University of Pennsylvania. She's also the vice dean of the Annenberg School for Communication and director of the Communication Neuroscience Lab. She is an expert in the science of behavior change. That's why you should come to After Hours. She will help you change your behavior. Her research uses tools from psychology, neuroscience, and communication to examine what makes messages persuasive, why and how ideas spread, and what makes people effective communicators. I'm sure she could give me some tips. And what a treat it is to welcome back Ethan Kross, author of the amazing new book, Shift, Managing Your Emotions So They Don't Manage You, and the international bestseller, Chatter, The Voice in Our Head, Why It Matters and How to Harness It. Ethan is one of the world's leading experts on emotion regulation and an award-winning professor in the University of Michigan's top-ranked psychology department and its Ross School of Business. He studies how the conversations people have with themselves impact their health, performance, decisions, and relationships. Oh, I hope you're ready for a great conversation. Let's welcome Emily Falk and Ethan Kross to FAN.
Well, thanks, Lonnie, for that wonderful intro. And Emily, it's so great to see you again. How are you doing this afternoon?
It's great to see you too, Ethan. I'm so grateful that you are doing this with me today.
Yeah, well, anytime I get a chance to see you, I take it. We should probably let folks know who are tuning in that we used to see each other a lot more frequently because before the University of Pennsylvania snatched you, you were a colleague of mine just down the road. So do miss you, but excited to be here talking about this amazing book, What We Value. So, I've looked at this book now a couple of times, Emily, and what I love about it is, number one, it gets to the core of, I think, what really makes us who we are, the choices we make. And it really deals with this phenomenon in a way that is humane. It really takes as its starting point that our choices are influenced by a variety of factors that may in the moment seem really like our choices make great sense, but a couple of hours, days, years later, we may not feel that way as well. And it does so with storytelling. So it's just a wonderful job. Bravo. Everyone who's here, you will enjoy this book. We had a chance to speak last week about this conversation. And during that conversation, you revealed to me that there was actually a choice about how to open this book that you regret having made or have thought about to some degree. So I thought I would ask if you're comfortable maybe sharing that story with the group, because I think it just springboards us into the conversation about choice and how complicated it can be. It was actually a choice you made that really speaks to the last time you saw your dad.
Yeah, thanks, Ethan. And I will say, one of the things that I thought a lot about when I was writing the book was about weaving together stories and science, and Chatter, your first book, was a real inspiration. I went through that introduction that you wrote many times thinking about how to do that so beautifully. So thanks for that example. And yeah, when we were talking last week, I was saying that when I was thinking about what parts of this story to share with readers, that there were certain parts that ended up getting left out. And one kind of backstory or context for this was that a little over 5 years ago, my dad died of a heart attack. And there are little pieces of that in the book, but I had considered whether to tell that story in a little bit more depth. And so that really is something that kind of underpins a lot of this concern about how do we choose and how do we make good choices and what does it mean to feel good or bad about them later. So I saw my dad for the last time in Maryland at a conference. I had gone to a conference with a number of colleagues in marketing and decision science, and my parents really generously agreed to come and take care of my kids while I was there. And that's such a special thing to get to have, parents who are willing to come and engage with your kids in that way. And they did a phenomenal job, but I really was focused on the task at hand, or what I thought was the task at hand, right? Of going to dinner with colleagues, going to coffee with colleagues, going to all the sessions, making sure that I, networked in whatever way. And yeah, I feel like there's a lot of times when I've thought about like how I had spent that time at the meeting.
Yeah, and the emotion that you're displaying, and thank you for sharing it with us. I think it's something that everyone on this call can relate to, because we all have decisions that, if only we could do those things over, we would probably do them differently. And yet in the moment, they felt so right. So let's shift from no pun intended. Let's shift from talking about that kind of decision, which in the moment felt right, to maybe something we do differently later on, and use it to unpack what's actually happening under the hood up here when we're making decisions. Because I think that's what the book, one of the things it does so beautifully, it really just kind of opens up the skull, if you will, and takes this unbelievably, or is it, I can't do it in reverse, that thing over there, this unbelievably complex organ, and it makes it so simple, right? You talk about there being these different systems in the brain, systems being areas, brain regions that work together, that talk with one another. You talk a lot about a valuation system, a self system, and a social system. And you talk about how they collide. So maybe just to give us a common vocabulary, tell us, how do these systems impact how we make our choices? And why do we sometimes quickly regret the choices that we make?
Sure. So the three systems, as you described, that I talk about the most in the book are the brain's value system, self-relevance, and social relevance systems. And the value system is the one that is handling our choices in this kind of final common pathway, where when we're choosing between, for example, having dinner with our parents or having dinner with colleagues, or choosing between eating a banana or eating a piece of chocolate cake, or thinking about, whether to keep doom scrolling or get up and go for a walk. It's integrating lots of different information from all different brain systems. So from emotional brain systems, from more deliberative, rational processing in our prefrontal cortex, from our sensory processing systems. And it's weighing all of these different factors that are available in our environment to assign subjective values to those possible options. So first, we figure out what we're choosing between, and then our brain assigns this subjective value to each potential option using this value calculation, as neuroscientists call it. And then afterwards, we get what's called a prediction error. So if something turns out to be better than we thought it would be, we get a positive prediction error. That makes it more likely that we'll do it in the future. If something turns out to be worse than we thought it would be, then a negative prediction error, which makes it maybe less likely that we would make that same choice again. So you asked me a little bit about, thinking about opening the book, and where I do end up opening the book is with another kind of related decision about spending time with my grandmother. And in the moment, at the time that I was writing this book, that's a choice that was feeling really important and salient to me, in part because of this experience that I had gone through losing my dad. And in part just because my grandmother's amazing. And, I really love spending time with her.
Tell everyone her name.
Her name is Beverly Fitzsimmons. So when I get to have time with Bev, it's like amazing. And yet there are these other kinds of forces that affect our ability to execute on those things, that when we take the time to really step back and think about what our bigger picture goals and values are, might get in the way. And some of them are, obvious practical constraints. But then there are these two other things that you brought up. One is our identities. Our self-relevance system is also constantly evaluating things in terms of whether they're me or not me. And those prescriptions about what we think our identities are and what that means are very intertwined with our value calculations. And we can delve into that more if you're interested. And then the other piece of this is these social systems that help us understand what other people think and feel. So norms are such a powerful force, even though people don't always realize how strongly they're impacting their brain's value calculations. And so together, these kind of like aspects of our identity, like for me, thinking of myself as a really serious scientist, as somebody who, had obligations to a big lab, and I wanted feedback on the latest work that I was doing. And also, like, I want to be able to connect my students with other people who are going to be relevant for their careers. So those aspects of self-relevance and social relevance loom really large when we're making day-to-day decisions. And we can lean into that in ways to, connect the ways that we actually want to spend our time with parts of our identity or with models of people whose behavior we would want to emulate. But often when we're not giving it a lot of thought, these things just unfold, because when neuroscientists talk about a value calculation, we're talking about something that happens like relatively instantaneously and seamlessly, and not always with a ton of attention.
And is one of your hopes for this book that shining a spotlight on the nuts and bolts that underlie these decisions will empower people to be a little bit more deliberate about how they make their choices?
Yeah, I think that's one potential outcome. I mean, certainly there are places where we can have a little bit more agency in our decision making, or at least see different possibilities that could be available to us, or a different way of approaching a choice or thinking about a situation. I went back and forth with my editor a lot, I'll say, because there was a lot of encouragement from my editorial team to sort of emphasize the potential agency angle. And that is something I hope people walk away with. But also, I think appreciation for how complicated these things are, maybe more compassion for ourselves, and also an appreciation for the places where we don't have agency, where there are these sort of societal forces, our culture, the constraints that make it easier for some of us than others to make certain kinds of choices, and what the consequences are. And so in that way, I think there's also a second goal, which is just for people to have an appreciation of like this very interesting and complicated thing that's happening all day, every day in our brains. And so then that might let us not only see more compassion for ourselves, but other people when we look and say, like, how does this make sense at all? To have a little bit more insight, or to be able to, as you were saying, shine a light. One of the metaphors that I really liked in thinking through this for the book was like, sometimes I get this feeling of like constriction, like I'm trapped in a cave and I like can't quite figure out where there might be more room to move. And that my hope is that sort of as people start to understand how the
Hey,
brain
that happens to you too? I thought I was the only one who had that feeling.
Yeah, I mean,
Nice.
very complementary books, right? Like
Yeah.
the shift concept, I think, also gives us a little more room. And also a parallel analogy of like, you talk about the workings of a car and shift, and how we can sort of shift gears. I've also thought about this sort of analogy of like, a lot of us can cook a meal, like we can maybe make our favorite pasta dish for dinner or something, but if you understand the chemistry of food, maybe it makes it a little easier to swap out ingredients, or maybe it makes it a little bit easier to understand when a recipe went wrong. And so likewise, I think, understanding how our psychology and neuroscience are unfolding might allow us to like swap out techniques, or understand what happened that we might want to rework in the future.
Got it. I want you to take us back to when you started grad school at UCLA. You tell this lovely story about having this kind of discovery where, well, why don't you tell us about the discovery? You know the story I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I feel a little,
It's great. Just go for it. Tell us.
so when I was in grad school, I was really interested in health behavior change. I was interested in what motivates people to change their behaviors in ways that are going to make them happier and healthier ultimately. And one of the pathways that interested me there was public health campaigns. And that still interests me. I'm in a communications school and I have an appointment in a marketing department. And I'm really interested in like what happens in people's brains as they're exposed to messaging that might be relevant for the choices that they make in the future. And when I first started out in grad school, we weren't sure if this would be possible at all. Like most of what was happening in cognitive neuroscience at that time involved studies that were contained and highly controlled in an fMRI scanner. So people would be exposed to different kinds of stimuli, look at what happened, and then the experiment would be over. And I was curious about whether there were things that were happening in people's brains as they were exposed to persuasive messages that might also give us some kind of insight about their behaviors that would follow. So in one of the really early studies that I ran, we showed people messages about sunscreen use. And I went to grad school in Los Angeles, so it's sunny. This is something people should be doing on a day-to-day basis, but most of the people in our study weren't. So they weren't wearing sunscreen every day. So we got their brain activity as they were being exposed to the messages. And then we had a surprise follow-up a week later where we asked them about how often they had worn sunscreen. And this allowed us to do a fairly straightforward comparison of like, was the level of engagement within parts of the brain that calculate things like self-relevance and value also associated with how much people were willing to change their behavior later. And I'll tell you, when I first started putting this study together, a lot of people were like, why would you possibly think that what happens in a brain scanner is going to tell you something about whatever happens in that person's life, you know, after they get out of the scan a week later? And I think my initial feeling was like, well, if you don't think that that's possible, then like, what are we doing here, right? Like, if there's not a way that we can make a link between these more controlled experiments and people's real world experiences, like that felt like something that would be really important to do. So anyway, getting to the part of the story that I think you were maybe pointing at, like when I first got the data back, like this is a part that I really love. Like when you're doing data analysis and you finally get to see you've done all this work, collecting the data, talking to the people, scanning their brains, whatever. And I finally saw like there was this relationship, the relationship that we predicted between activity within the medial prefrontal cortex and the amount that people had changed their behavior. And there was this couch that we had gotten like off the street or from like a Craigslist ad. Sylvia Morelli and I shared this tiny little office that was painted toothpaste green. And I started jumping up and down on the couch. And I was like so excited that there was this relationship. And I like sprinted down the hall and I started knocking on Matt Lieberman, my grad school advisor's door. I was like, Matt, there's this relationship here. Like, you'll never believe it. And it was so joyful because it made me feel like, oh, maybe there's a there. Like maybe this is something that will give us a different perspective on something that's really hard, which is changing people's behavior.
And if I'm not mistaken, that link between the brain predicting behavior, that was something that you didn't see in people's self-reports. Is
Yeah,
that right?
so when we put both the brain activity and what people told us in surveys into the same statistical model, one possibility was like that information would be completely redundant, that like we scan the brains and maybe we learn something interesting about the brain. And we ask people questions in surveys like, how much do you intend to use sunscreen? Like, how do you feel about sunscreen? How capable do you feel about using sunscreen? Like all of those kinds of questions that psychologists might typically ask if we're trying to predict people's behavior. And what was really cool was that they gave us different information. So what people told us and what their brains told us complemented each other. So we found this with sunscreen use, but we've also found it with smoking and physical activity, other kinds of behaviors, is that kind of weirdly, the information that people report to us in self-reports seems like it's at least partially distinct from what's happening in that value system or in the self-relevance system in the brain. And so when we put them together, we do better at predicting than when we have either one on its own.
So as you no doubt know, I don't know if you've been following this as closely as I have, but there's this whole industry of brain computer interfaces that is bursting on the scene. And this is pretty wild. So through, super powered now with AI, you've got groups that are implanting chips in people's brains and using those chips that are AI powered to essentially decode neural activity and translating it into thought. So what does that mean? It means that people who have had strokes and suffered from other kinds of neural impairments now can actually begin communicating with other people again. It's wild. It's the stuff of science fiction. My guess is that we're not too far off from having those chips that we can implant and maybe have them connect with our evaluation system. And on the one hand, like I sure am, I'd be curious to know like what my valuation system is doing when I approach important choices that I may not be aware of myself consciously. Do you think it's a good idea for folks to have access to how their valuation system is operating with a chip like that? Because this may be reality now a lot quicker than we think. Or do you think that there are some things that are best left under the hood?
Yeah, that's such a provocative question, Ethan. Love it. I guess I will share with the broader audience some things that I know you know about me, but other people might not. So one is I'm married to a cryptographer, which is somebody who studies information, privacy, and security for a living. So in our house, we talk a lot about AI, and we talk a lot about the sort of privacy and control and legibility of what's happening in these systems. And I think we are at a very critical moment in terms of a number of different pieces of this puzzle. I mean, one of them being who gets to control the information, right? Because as a public, we have basically ceded all of our control of our data to large corporations whose interests may or may not align with ours. I would also just sort of take a step back for a second and say, even absent chips in our brains, which we can come back to, and I'm super curious what you're thinking about this as you're following it. There are so many forces that are influencing the activation of our brains and hence our decision making that are controlled by related things, right? So as we think about things like AI friends or agents, like there's one world where we just get to like have a really empathic sounding board and, you know, an agent who can take a step back and use some of the techniques that your science has highlighted. But I think there's also a world where corporate interests that, again, have financial motives that are distinct from what us as individuals, we as individuals might think of as our most important core values, are trying to persuade us to buy things or, you know, making recommendations where if it were a human friend, we might have a little bit more trust or access into why they're doing what they're doing. Even if it's not at the level of like, I know these particular neurons are firing and I know every single thing that went into this decision calculus. So, you know, such a important time for people to be paying attention to what's going on and then engaging in terms of this democracy about like, where do we want regulation and like, what's that going to mean? So I'd be so curious to hear what you're thinking. Do you want chips in your brain?
No, I do not. I want to keep this very private. I think about things all the time that I don't want any other human beings to know that I'm thinking about. You know, those of you who are listening, don't get alarmed. But that's we know that this is how the human brain operates, right? We're constantly simulating all sorts of situations, a lot of them improbable, and I think the privacy concerns are really significant. We ultimately experience all sorts of thoughts, but we don't act on them. And I think the action is what matters most, of course. But back to the chip for the valuation system, I think what really led me to ask that question was, if you have a system that is guiding behavior pretty powerfully, but people aren't really aware of how that system is affecting them, and I could see some value to it. But based on what you described of your first study, and I'm guessing several others, there is some conscious accessibility we have of what's happened of what's happening under the hood. So it's not like most people are blind to that
Yeah,
entirely. Fair to
yeah,
say?
totally. And, you know, our colleagues, Hetty Kober and Molly Crockett, have used the word agentic alignment, which I really love as a word or a way of thinking about this to say, you know, on one hand, social psychologists and cognitive neuroscientists have said, well, maybe there are pieces of this that are just like inaccessible to conscious awareness. And on the other hand, our colleagues in clinical psychology have suggested that like therapy or, you know, ways that we spend time meditating or trying to gain more awareness of what's actually going on can be useful if we want to do things differently in the future. And so bringing those perspectives together to say, well, it may be the case that in our day-to-day busy lives, we're not putting a lot of focus on those things, but that, again, if we start to understand how they work, how these processes unfold in our brains, how the value system works, how the self-relevance system works, how our social systems work, and how those interface with the people around us, with our social networks, with the kinds of contexts that we find ourselves in, then maybe we can be a little bit more deliberate in choosing. Maybe we can sort of find a flashlight in that cave and see like, oh, here's a lever that I can pull, or there's a skylight and I can like actually get a little bit more perspective in this situation. So yes, I do think that people can have more agency in that process than we often give ourselves the opportunity for.
So you have a chapter in the book that talks about power and how power can powerfully influence what we value, how we make choices. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that. And I have absolutely experienced this firsthand, not in me becoming more powerful, but in witnessing other folks around me become more powerful. And it's like they become another person. It really affects the way they navigate the world. And tell us what you know about that.
Yeah. Well, we know that power and status change the way that people's social relevance systems work, for example. So one early study that I was part of when I was in grad school that Keely Muscatel led looked at what happened in people's brains as they were just hearing stories about other people or looking at faces of peers. And depending on their level of social status, we saw different amounts of activation in these brain systems that help us think about what other people are thinking and feeling. And so this complements a lot of research in psychology about as people rise up in organizations, that they sometimes take other people's perspectives less. And so there's this sort of unfortunate confluence of events where just when we're at the point where we could have so much more positive influence on the people around us if we really understood what they were thinking and feeling, that various demands or other things make it so that people by default might do that less than they do. And yet when people are good at this, when people learn how to gather information about other people's perspectives and use it, that it makes them better leaders and makes them more successful and makes it easier for them to innovate in important ways. And so yeah, that kind of combining what Adam Galinsky calls power and steering really is an important skill to cultivate.
Well, let me jump in there. So
Yeah.
why do you think there's this strong push to becoming less socially sensitive, maybe less empathic, that naturally follows becoming more powerful? Because what you just described is that actually the folks who do best are the powerful ones who remember to perspective take and empathize. But it seems like our default is to push in the opposite direction. So why do you think that is?
Well, I think that there are a lot of potential reasons. Like one is it's work. So in the chapter that you're describing, I had the pleasure of getting to interview Tanya Mosley, who is just a phenomenal radio interviewer. She is a co-host of Fresh Air, and she's made a number of really very moving podcasts. Like her podcast, Truth Be Told, is fantastic. Highly recommend that. And so as Tanya got more sort of power and status in the journalism world, and started making her own show and, founding a production company, she was noticing like, oh, like, when you have an idea, maybe just fire off an email, for example, right? And so I think it takes a lot of self-regulation to remember that once you have that power and status, that other people respond to you in a different way. So if you're getting an email from a peer at 11 p.m., you may or may not feel pressure to respond to it right away. But if you're getting that email from your boss, that same behavior that you could do before without really giving it a second thought is going to have consequences for other people who maybe now feel like they need to jump and they need to respond in order to stay in your good graces because you have that power over them. So I was really impressed. this is kind of a very minor detail in that chapter, but Tanya and I spoke for a long time about the ways that she's been really deliberate in trying to live the values that she talks about on the show of like basically helping that workplace be a place where people can be well, which starts with the leadership. And so, I think one thing is that it's work to do that extra perspective taking. And another thing is that I think we also often end up with many different kinds of considerations, right? As we have more responsibility, like I'll just speak from personal experience for a second, like running my lab, which is really large right now, and also serving as the vice dean of the school, and running the climate communication division. Like there's a lot going
Stressing me
on.
out. You're stressing me out. Why are you doing all this stuff?
So there's a lot of opportunities, right? Like same basic impetus as running those sunscreen studies earlier. Like how can we do stuff that's helpful to people? But when we have so many balls in the air, sometimes I think it can be hard to remember that like the simulations that happen in our minds are really convincing. And we have to do that extra work to find out whether we're right about what other people are thinking and feeling as well.
And do you think the reason we become less tuned to the social context as we move higher is because when we're trying to move up the ladder, being tuned to that social context actually helps us get there? Is that is that a reason why we do it less? Because once we don't need to pay attention as much, we've already reached the pinnacle.
Or maybe the people are looking up to, whoever's above them, even when they're at the higher levels, right? Like I think, what you were just saying calls to mind for me some research that I really love about people spontaneously taking other people's perspectives. And so there have been a series of studies that have looked at what happens in people's brains when they look at the faces of other people in their social networks. So often this is like a dorm full of students or a social group on a particular campus. So everybody knows each other and is familiar with one another. And what there's a study that Noam Zerubbabel ran in Kevin Oxner's lab, one that Sylvia Morelli, my grad school office mate, ran after she became a postdoc in Jamil Zaki's lab. And what they find is that we automatically track various kinds of social status of other people. So for example, in Noam and Kevin's work, it was popularity. So is this the face of somebody who is nominated by many other people as being likable? So popular people. So our social relevance systems, our mentalizing systems are tracking other people's popularity. In Sylvia and Jamil's work, it's whether this person is nominated by many other people as being empathic. So these empathy hubs in social networks. So I think it makes sense that we're not able to pay attention to like literally everybody in the world, but as you're suggesting, maybe the people that we think are most relevant to our social goals. And so our brains are sort of automatically keeping track of certain kinds of people more than others. So in those two examples, people who are popular, people who are really empathic, who might be relevant to us in the future. But then what about everybody else? Like, what about the people who aren't nominated by every single person in the network as being really likable or really empathic? Like, we might need to shift our thinking and more deliberately apply energy if we want to learn from them as well.
So you mentioned that sometimes the simulations that we engage in our minds are out of touch with reality. And I think that's probably something that most people on this Zoom can relate to at times. I know that when I talk to people about worry and anxiety or sadness, they describe the experience as it feels so real what's happening in their head. They're engaging in all these what if scenarios that they don't even feel comfortable articulating out loud because they're so outlandish. And yet, in the moment, this is like a gripping Oscar-worthy film. Those simulations that we engage in have clear implications for the valuation process and certainly the choices we make, right? Like I think a lot of us have made choices in our lives as a function of simulations that were not really tightly tuned to reality. Do you have any thoughts about what people can do to guard against their simulations run wild, maybe leading them to make choices that they may ultimately regret?
Yeah, I think that one of the things you're highlighting is that first knowing that that's a possibility is useful. Knowing that, okay, do you remember our grants manager, Laura, at the Research Center for Group Dynamics at Michigan? So we had this amazing grants manager named Laura, and she had a poster in her office and it said, "You don't have to believe everything that you think." And I think when we understand that our brains might be, and certainly often are, doing things that will trick us or that are simulations that may or may not be grounded in reality, then that gives us the opportunity to check our assumptions. So for example, when we're thinking about these kind of social scenarios, if I think like, oh, I had this conversation with Ethan the other day and like, I wonder if the thing that I said offended him. And then maybe I go around and I'm ruminating about it. And I have this like very vivid, scenario, as you said, movie that's playing in my mind about how mad you're going to be and how like maybe you don't want me to call you and like all of these things, right? Like that might then influence, I mean, not might, it's certainly going to influence the value calculation that I'm making, for example, about how rewarding it's going to be to me in this moment to call you up and check in, right? And yet, probably it was fine. And if we talked about it, like maybe I did offend you, and you could say, "Hey, yeah, that really did hurt my feelings, but like I still care about you, and like we could figure out a solution." Or maybe you'd be like, "I didn't even notice that," right? And so, being able to gather evidence that is grounded in reality is a tool in cognitive behavioral therapy and other places where we learn to gather evidence. And in terms of the daily decisions that we're making, we don't necessarily want to be trying to do this in depth for every single thing because that would be a huge burden. But when choices are really important and consequential, and I would say like whether to reconnect with a friend is an important consequential thing. Like if you're avoiding somebody that you care about because of a scenario that's playing out in your mind, like, and that's a person you actually would really like to be connected to, like, that's a high stakes kind of decision. Like it's worth doing some assumption checking there. And these other kinds of things that, might have to do with like choosing a new job or who we're going to spend our time with or how we're going to behave in particular situations. Those are situations where in order to have a good decision process, we want to get information that's as accurate as possible. So maybe we can talk to people who've been through something like this before. Maybe we can gather information about like what the actual strengths and limitations of a particular job candidate are, whatever. So we can gather more information. And I really love Annie Duke in her book, How to Decide, does a really beautiful job of distinguishing between decision outcomes, which is often where we get that feedback and we have the prediction error that's like, oh, that was better than I thought or worse than I thought. And we ground on those outcomes so strongly when really what we might want to pay more attention to is like, was the process that I went through in order to make this decision a good process? Did I focus on the right things? Did I, gather the information that I could have gathered at the time? And that's part of what I mean when I say, I hope that reading this book will give people a little bit more compassion, is that they can reflect on that process. And if there are things that they want to change in the future about how they decide, great. But just because an outcome didn't turn out the way you wanted it to turn out, like that doesn't actually mean it was a bad decision, right? Sometimes we have bad luck and like, that's not your fault.
Right. All right, there's one more topic I want to talk about. Time's flying, and then I want to bring it back to your dad. I want to talk about defensiveness because I think this is something that everyone on this Zoom has also had some experiences with. And well, why don't you share your your wonderful defensiveness anecdote from the book because I think it's a great one, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, well, in the chapter about defensiveness, the story that I open with is one that I'm imagining a lot of people might be able to relate to. One night, I was in my kitchen with my partner, Brett, and usually after our kids go to bed, we have maybe an hour or so where we hang out. And Brett is the best because he is just as happy doing dishes as not doing dishes. So I get to like sit in this comfy chair and try to entertain him while he does dishes and like cleans up the kitchen and is just like this amazing force of nature. And so in this particular evening, I'm sitting in the comfy chair and Brett's like doing dishes, and I was like dealing with some email, responding to my students, like again, identity as like a responsive mentor, and boss, like makes me want to respond to students really quickly on email. And Brett was like, when you're on your phone, when we're hanging out, I feel really bad. Like it makes me feel like you're not paying attention and like don't care about this time that we're having. It makes me feel like you don't care about what I'm saying. And when he said that, like my initial reaction was like, well, no, of course I'm paying attention to you. Like I can totally tell you about the probably AI story that you were telling me. But I didn't want that to be true, right? Like I came up with all of these reasons why my phone use was totally reasonable. I'm just going to get this thing off really quickly. It was 2 seconds. Like I can look up information that's relevant to the story that you're telling me. Like, see, I'm contributing. But when I actually thought about it, like took a step back the next day, after I had tried to explain to Brett the night before why it wasn't so bad, I was like, oh, yeah, like does really stink when somebody is on the phone with you. And there's actually been research that shows that people think that their own phone use is not disruptive, but everybody hates it when somebody else is on a device when they're hanging out with them. And so that made me think like I should probably think about setting up this context a little bit differently so that I'm not tempted to be on my phone, because like we also know our brain's value systems are so tuned to these like immediate rewards, and the internet is so tuned to sucking us in and hijacking those systems that like just exerting willpower was probably not the right choice either, because like I don't want to even be distracted by having that phone in my pocket like buzzing, because even if Brett doesn't notice, like I'll know, right? So started trying to leave my phone in the other room, or just more deliberately spending time together.
So like break it down for me in terms of um, emotion in the brain, the self system, because when I think about times that I'm defensive, it's extremely rare, by the way, very rare. But when I am, when I cease to be defensive, like everything gets better. It's just so much easier to not be defensive. And yet there's often this powerful instinct, I think, that most of us have to protect our ego, protect ourselves, and ergo the defensive response. So, what do we know from the brain level in terms of why we see that kind of almost alarm-like response activate when there's this perceived threat? You talk about a little bit in the book, and I found it really useful. So maybe you could just share that with folks.
Yeah. So one of the things that's really useful is that we have these biases, these self-protective biases, where our self-relevance system isn't just like objectively going around and tallying all the good and bad things that we do, but rather that our self-relevance and value systems are really intertwined, where we tend to think of things that are good as me and things that are bad as not me. And this allows us to maintain sort of a coherent sense of self, to maintain a sense of self-esteem, like all kinds of things that are actually like pretty healthy psychologically in moderation. But it also means that we hold on really tightly to the things that we've already done. We really double down. We come up with reasons why, like, well, that might apply to somebody else. Like, sure, when, my sister uses her phone in the room, it's annoying, but when I do it, it's helpful. Um, and and so that can sort of make it so that we're giving up opportunities for change or for learning new information. But what we see is that when we help people take a step back and let go of some of that defensiveness, not only does it feel good, but also it sort of opens up their self-relevance and value systems, to be more receptive. So in one study where we had folks who are relatively sedentary and getting coaching about how to get more physical activity, when people were just given that coaching cold, they showed less responsiveness in the self-relevance and value systems than when we first gave them the opportunity to reflect on values that matter to them. So that kind of values affirmation exercise is one tool that we have for helping people kind of let go of some of the basic defensiveness that many of us feel when we're confronted with the idea that like the thing we were doing in the past might not be the best thing for ourselves or for other people, or that there would be some benefit to changing. So when people were given the chance to affirm their core values by reflecting on situations where, for example, let's say friends and family is your most important values, like situations where you might do something meaningful with your friends and family in the future, or situations where your friends and family have really helped you overcome something challenging. Taking that step back and zooming out and seeing like, oh, my self-worth isn't actually tied to like whether or not I get some extra steps during the day, or whether I loaded the dishwasher in the way that my partner likes, or whether I happen to be using my phone this evening, and that was annoying for Brett. Then we see more activation in these regions and correspondingly more receptiveness to change.
I want to go back to your dad. I think we've all lost people, and part of what is so terrifying about the thought of losing someone is that they're gone forever. And if there's someone who is close to us, that's a really painful concept to contemplate. But you end the book on such a beautiful note with respect to this issue. You talk about a colleague of yours, Emile Brunel. Brunel, am I pronouncing his name?
Bruno.
Brunel, who tragically passed away not too long ago, who talked about how people we care about can actually continue to affect quite powerfully the choices we make. I want to read a little excerpt from your book, from the epilogue, where you talk about how he describes this process, because I think it fits so wonderfully with what we now know about simulations and how the brain computes value. I want to ask you a question about your dad after I read it. So this is what Emily writes. So many of the ways we engage with each other actually come down to engagement with the ideas we each carry, the stories and the practices, what we think and what we think someone else might be thinking. We don't spend that much time physically with most people, even when they are alive. Our relationships with them play out mostly in our minds. Yet these relationships influence how we understand ourselves today and how we make the choices that determine who we will be tomorrow. And so we started on a very personal note with your dad, but my question for you is, how is your dad impacting the choices that you are making today?
Yeah, there are so many ways. And so I guess, one thing that maybe I'll share with you is right before my dad died, he had gone on this meditation retreat. He had spent 10 days in a context where everybody was on a meditation retreat. And afterwards, he sent an email to a bunch of us who were sort of friends and close family, and talked a little bit about that decision. Like, why would you ever want to go spend 10 days with no wallet, no phone, no car keys, no talking with other people, get up at 4 o'clock in the morning every day and spend 10 of your next 17 waking hours in silent meditation? And in articulating what he was thinking, what he wrote was, to answer this question, he said, a quick summation or attempt to answer the question, at least for me, what's the point? Each of us will have an unknown but finite number of heartbeats or moments in our lifetime, each of those of equal value. So if we spend any of them making ourselves miserable or angry or any other unproductive emotion over something we've deluded ourselves into thinking is important, we're robbing that moment of the possibility of happiness. And, I think this is like a really complicated set of ideas to unpack. And in your most recent book, Shift, you talk a little bit about what some of the value of some of those harder to grapple with emotions like anger can motivate us to go and protest or to do big things, or sadness can help us reach out and connect with other people. But I really think at the core of what he was trying to say was like, how can we lead a life that is meaningful, that involves joy, where we see this kind of possibility? And for him, that kind of like internal reflection and meditation was one path to that. And so I've definitely spent much more time in the past few years thinking about those kinds of questions, meditating and learning about those kinds of practices. But I think this book is also about some of those things, sort of absent more of the contemplative practices, but more like, how can we gain insight from lots of different perspectives, from neuroscience, from psychology, from the beautiful stories that we learn from one another, that can help us make sense of who we are. So that's one part of it. Another sort of more concrete thing is that I have been working on learning how to play the guitar. That's something that, like, very concretely, my dad used to play the guitar all the time. He'd bring his guitar over to our house and play with my kids, and just be so patient with them. Like, as he was playing music, and they would be tiny little kids, like batting at the strings and screaming into a microphone, and he just was like there for it. And so both in the like physical practice of trying to learn how to do a really hard thing, like play a musical instrument, and in supporting my kids to do that, but also in sort of that vibe of like being present with the people that we're with. Those are all things that, I really hope to emulate.
Well, I can tell you that just hearing that quote from your dad has already changed the way I think about choices that I need to make this afternoon. Boy, that was liberating. I mean, I had never heard that way of describing a heartbeat. Like, I want every heartbeat to count, And so, and just to bring it back to what we talked about before on simulation, I think there's no limit to our ability to conjure up mental simulations of the people we care about. And if those people are resources that aided us while they were alive in our ability to make good choices, like, my God, load them up and keep having them impact us after they're gone. So thank you for sharing that. Thank you for this wonderful book. It's not just put up there. It's a cool cover as well. Um, it's not just your dad that has impacted me and how I'm thinking about making choices based on what I've just heard, but this book has too. Ever since I dove into it, I start thinking about, like, okay, how's the social computations and the self computations like coming together to impact what I'm valuing here, and I find it really valuable. So thanks for this conversation, Emily.
Yeah, thanks, Ethan. I really appreciate you being here with me, and yeah, just being a kind of person who is there for all of these kinds of conversations.
My pleasure. And back over to Lonnie.
Thank you both for co-creating such a magical hour for everyone who's watching and who will watch later on YouTube. I mean, what a thoughtful, sensitive, responsive, close listening, close responses. It was just such a pleasure to listen and engage with both of you. So thank you so much, Ethan, particularly for your preparation. I wish I could, clone you for all remaining fan programs. So thank you so much. We really, really appreciate that. I want to remind folks, Emily will be spending another hour with us beginning at 1:05 Central. So that's 2:05 if you're East Coast. She'll be spending 55 minutes technically with us to answer questions, talk more about her work, answer any observations or comments you might have about today or her work. How do you get to come to After Hours? We are doing a book giveaway. We're giving away 100 copies of the book. So for After Hours, we're doing make a donation in any meaningful amount to you, to FAN. And we've been putting the links in chat. You can also go to the FAN website. There's a donate button, same button. Send us whatever works for you, works for us. And we are happy to then send you a registration link for After Hours. There's a quick little question or two to register. We have a couple questions that I'd like to jump into, one in particular, well, two of them actually. One came in during the event. if that's okay with you, Emily, if we can pivot really quickly. The question is, actually, before I ask the question, because I meant to say, I want to remind folks that Ethan Kross will be joining FAN. We get to have the pleasure of his company one more time this year, which we're so thrilled, and we hope many more times in the future. Ethan will be joining. I want to grab my exact date because I don't want to misspeak here. I want to make sure that, okay. Ethan will be joining us on Tuesday, May 6th, also on Zoom for a Grand Rounds presentation that he'll be doing also at noon. So if you like this noon slot, there'll be another opportunity for a noon program. He'll be in conversation with a big friend of FAN, Dr. David Schreiber, who is the founder and medical director of Compass Health Center. They will be discussing Ethan's new book. They are giving Compass is offering CEs for Illinois clinicians, which is great, and we're doing a fairly significant book giveaway for that event as well. So check out, it's not yet on our website. It is on Compass's website that you can register. It'll be on our website soon, but that's May 6th. Back to the question. So Anna Maria Acosta has posted this question. How is the concept of implicit bias related to the self-relevance and value systems? There was a lot of social justice work and training centered on implicit bias, but there was also criticism that the concept of implicit bias was not supported by research and that early studies on implicit bias were flawed.
Yeah, a lot of big questions packed into that question. So thank you for that. One thing I will say is that implicit bias is a thing, and so is explicit bias. And so I think one of the things we want to keep in mind is that both of those things are a thing. And when we think about the neuroscience side of it, one of the studies that I describe in the book is a meta-analysis. So a scientific study that aggregates findings from many other scientific studies, looking at how activation in that social brain system, social relevance system that Ethan and I were talking about earlier, responds to people who are part of our in-groups, people who we think of being like us versus people who aren't. And by default, often we show more activation in the social relevance system to people who are like us. The other thing that I think is relevant here is that there have been a number of neuroscience studies looking not just at whether somebody's like us or not like us, but whether they're part of groups that have been marginalized or minoritized. So for example, looking at people's responses to the faces of Black Americans versus white Americans. And we see that happening in emotional responding systems like the amygdala, where people show different responses to faces of different racial groups. But the thing is that that doesn't necessarily have to mean that we act in biased ways. So there's also research that highlights the ways that we can bring our prefrontal cortex online to override those kinds of biases. So just because our culture ingrains certain kinds of biases into our thinking or our automatic reactions, that doesn't mean that we're doomed or that there aren't things that we can do. And so some of the things that we can do are think about, what kinds of inputs are coming into our brains in the first place. Like, whose stuff are you reading? Whose podcasts are you listening to? Like, whose perspectives do you have the most access to? And where can you get more information from people from a diverse range of backgrounds? And yeah, we can, just like we were talking about before with kind of a more general class of decision making, when we take a step back and prioritize paying attention to how we're making decisions, to be aware of those kinds of things, and the possibility that we might be biased in our decision making. I think that is another tool that we have in our toolkit. And doing things collaboratively.
Sorry, I'm also watching your time because I know Ethan needs to leave as well. So thank you. And I know maybe at after hours we can explore a little bit as well and extend that conversation. Ethan, again, pleasure. Look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks. Thanks for your time today, very much so. Thanks everybody for tuning in.